J.T. Crowley is Talking Books. On the show, you'll hear from emerging talent and seasoned veterans from around the world. They'll give you their take on the writing process and how to create the secret sauce of page-turning deliciousness. Let's get into that magical mixture of the art and science of creativity. Here's J.T. Crowley, author of The Smart Kids, and your podcast host.
Hello, I'm J.T. Crowley, and today I'm very honored to have on the show Larry Morphew. He's from Hot Springs National Park in Arkansas. Now, Larry spent most of his life in broadcasting, both in radio and television. In previous chats, Larry has talked to me about some of the people he's interviewed and now finds himself the other way around, actually being interviewed himself, which is a different role for him. He's written his debut book, Country Folk, which consists of 3 short stories, everybody. It's about rural life in Arkansas back in the early 1900s and also what 2 of his brothers got up to in the 1950s. So without further ado, let's invite Larry onto the show to talk about his book and a little about himself. Larry, come and join me.
Thank you, John. Glad to be here.
Oh, it's a complete pleasure. And, when I've looked at your book, I'm thinking, wow, there's been some interesting little chit-chats here, especially about some of the family members.
There's a lot of stories there, yes.
Oh, absolutely. So, Larry, you've spent 40 years in broadcasting. So why now the book and why the content? And is this book really very close to your heart?
It is very close to my heart, John. The story that got me started was the first frost. My mother related that story to me years ago. And, people today, sometimes we complain because we don't have this or we don't have this. We don't have a new pair of shoes. They only had 1 pair of shoes a year. And most of the time it came when the first frost came. The little toes would be cold, cold, cold.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really exciting because Christmas was much different than it is now. The presents that they got for Christmas was usually an apple or an orange and maybe a couple of pieces of hard candy. That was it. So the shoes were a great gift compared to what they got at Christmas. So it was really anticipated, that first frost, Nettie, when she was walking, and Nettie was my mother, by the way, she'd pull her fingers up those blades of grass to see if there was a little bit of ice in them because she was wanting it so badly. But when she finally got to that, the shoes were only about $2.95 to $3.25 back then. And there weren't a lot of different varieties to choose from. You got what they had. And when she went to the store, they didn't have a size to fit her.
I know.
She was heartbroken over that.
She was, wasn't she? So from the initial concept of the book to actually getting the physical book into your hands, how long did that take?
I wrote the first frost, I think, in 2013. So it sat there for 7 years. And when I retired from broadcasting, I was kind of bored. But, I've written all my life. In radio, I wrote news stories continuously. So I've been writing really ever since high school. My first story I wrote, I think I was in the 11th grade in high school. But I never really thought about publishing. I had people tell me back then when they read my first story, you should be a writer. But I was too interested in broadcasting at that time to really think about being serious about it.
The 3 stories, I'm fascinated with the speech marks because you've gone back to like local dialect, local sayings.
Yes.
Was that done deliberately to make the stories authentic?
It was, John, but on the other hand, being born in 1950, I caught some of this dialect. In fact, I still hear people doing it that live in the country now. And I really didn't think of it as being Elizabethan type dialogue. And I wrote that because that's how people really talked to a degree. Some people talked with more of a dialect than actually what I had written. I had my editor a sweet lady named Judy Bonds was looking at it, and she's, I've got trouble with this dialect, it's hard for people to understand. And I said, well, that's the way that people really talked back then.
Yeah.
And I went back and modified it a little bit, but it was very much dialect from everyone. And, today, even years ago, they would call someone who talked with a dialect like that a hillbilly. They were country people. They were from the backwoods, the rural areas. And slowly it's dissipated. And when I was in broadcasting, in fact, I was in college and I really didn't know how to pronounce thing. The people here, it was thang. And it was not get, it was get. We're going to get it. So the dialect is something that it really existed. I wanted to do it to separate the characters, of course, but I wanted it to be pretty authentic to what they actually did.
Well, of course, I mean, say in the States, rural people are referred to as hillbillies, aren't they? Over here in the UK, and a bit of like country bumpkins.
Yes.
So, different sayings, but the same sort of rural people. Can I get to the first story? Because I quite like this one, but I have to say to you that the first Frost was my favourite. But I'm going to talk about Sadie first of all. Now, the first story, this is the longest story in the book. And I understand, Sadie's based on a true life of one of your aunts and what she went through, experienced at the hands of, how shall I say, an unloving father, perhaps a cruel father, but equally a kind Uncle Taddy. So life was hard, wasn't it, for country folk back in Arkansas, back in 1912?
Yes, it was very difficult. I after I had written the story and published the book, I found a writing that my mother did. I was always concerned about things that happened back then, things that I'd missed. I wanted to know about it. And my siblings, they had it much more difficult than I ever had it. My mother wrote all these details about things that happened. She said they never went without food. And a lot of people did. And she did later in her life after she grew up and got married. Sometimes food was very scarce. But the difficulty with what mother pointed out was my grandfather was mean. He would fly off the handle. He would beat his livestock. According to my mother, she said that she was more meek. She and the youngest sister didn't talk back. They called it sassing. But Sadie and her older half brother would talk back to our grandfather. And when that happened, it was bad. He would have an outburst of anger. In fact, I had heard mother say more than one time that he had seen him grab Sadie by the hair and bang her head against the smokehouse door. They were required to work. They couldn't sit in on the laptop or the iPhone and play all day. They had to get out and do something. They had no electricity. They had no television. Of course, it wasn't around at that time. No radios, because the first radios didn't start coming out until the 20s.
They entertained themselves, didn't they?
I debated, John, over whether to change the names because of how it looked to my grandfather. And I talked to my siblings, what do you think about it? Do you think I should change that name?
Yeah.
One of our brothers says, I don't think any of our family would have any difficulty with that. And after thinking about it, I realized that this was his legacy that he left, and it wasn't a good one.
Yeah. I don't want to give the game away because the whole idea of the chat is just to give people a flavour of the book.
Right, yeah.
It's a fascinating story, and it's a bittersweet story, from her father through to, and then the kind uncle, Uncle Taddy, which, him and his wife, and the story there, when they find her in the barn, it's just absolutely wonderful. They're heartwarming, feeling for her and looking after her. Yeah. But I have to say, Larry, out of the three stories, the one that's for me, because I can resonate with it, is the second story, The First Frost. Right. this is the story, as you've said, it's the story about your mother, Nettie.
Yes.
And, they're from the Washita Mountains. They're poor. They're very poor. And a lot of the families, when I've done my research there, they were large families. They were poor families. They didn't have much. And one of the reasons why this story resonates with me is because it relates back to my own grandmother, who, like yourself, she was from a large family. She was one of 12, and you're one of 11. You're the 11th sibling, but I think she was the second. And they were from Ireland. And they often went without no shoes for a long time. And they were lucky if they got shoes in the wintertime. And this is what this story is about, isn't it? It's they were barefooted, poor, and her dream was to get a pair of shoes for the winter.
Yes. And those shoes back in those days only lasted a few months. By the time spring came around, they were worn out, and they went barefoot up until the next frost.
I love the little bit, when they go off on a Saturday morning into the local town, and her brother sort of sidelines her on the way, down the dirt tracks as they're heading off with the horse and cart with their father into town. And, and he's always often he hijacks her and plays tricks on her, doesn't he?
Yes, he was. He was a little mischievous, as most boys are at that age. I probably added a little bit more mischief to him than actually existed.
Why not? Why not?
I've got pranks in the next one that I'm writing as well.
Oh, I know. Oh, really? I'm coming to that. Don't you worry. I'm coming to that. So for me, this was a story that I could, relate to, particularly my own grandmother telling me the story that they went barefoot throughout the summer and, late spring. And they'd be lucky if they got a pair of shoes for the winter. And it'd probably be hand-me-downs from somebody else as well. Yes. And they only lasted a few months because they weren't well made in those days. I want to go to the final story, because these are short stories and I don't want to give too much away. I just want to give listeners and viewers just a flavor of what's in this endearing book of yours, Larry. Now, the third story, everybody, is Tinker, Tot and Dewdober. Now, I know you're laughing here, and I know you're laughing. Tinker and Tot are some of your older brothers. Am I right?
That's correct, yes. Tot is 5 years older than me, and Tinker is 8 years older than me.
Ah. Now, this story, I believe, was set in 1955?
About 1955, yes.
When you were 5 years old? And a lot of people can remember, particularly in the rural communities, that, in those days, still the farming community, the rural communities, they were relatively poor. And there were large families. And I can remember my grandmother saying to me, they slept 2 or 3 to a bed. And looking at the story here of Tinker, Tot and Dewdober, they slept 2 or 3 to a bed, didn't they?
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, until I was I think it was in my early teens when I actually got a bed by myself. Most of the time it was 3 in a bed.
So this story is all about, because Arkansas, in a bit like Oklahoma and Tennessee, they can get some bad storms that blow through the area. And the surges from the local creeks, we call them rivers over here. These creeks, they can swell and they become quite dangerous. And of course, this is this misadventure story of the 3 boys. Now, I believe Dewdober was a friend. Am I right?
He was a next door neighbor, yes.
And this is the short story of the day the 3 boys went to a misadventure down by Brooker Creek. Am I right?
Yes, they were absolutely. A river, I'm not sure exactly what is classified as a river from a creek, but the creeks are smaller. But when this occurred, that creek became a river. It was really, really rolling. And along this creek from the years of being swollen and flooding, there were huge boulders that had been sticking up out there in the water. And when that water would hit them, it would be a powerful surge upward. And they wanted to swim it. And the real thing about the story, when it was all finished, I said, man, that was fun. What can we do now?
But they nearly didn't get out of it, did they?
They nearly didn't. Mother had a lot of kids, so she didn't have time to watch them like we require to be done these days. Kids were pretty much on their own, and they were in a position that the younger ones were always looked over by the older ones. You know, they kind of took care of their sibling. But in this case, there was a little bit of lapse in staying out of danger.
Parentage, yeah. Tinker and Tot are nicknames for your brothers, aren't they?
Yes, Tinker's real name is Bob or Bobby, and Tut's real name is Terry.
Right.
And when I had one of my brothers I said, call Hoyt and see if it's okay if I use his name in the story. And he called him up, and he said he didn't even remember it. My brothers did, because they were scared to death. I don't know if he ever did, but he let me use his name anyway, so I was happy about that.
Well, he was the one that kept his pants on, didn't he?
Yes, and part of the way, when he got out the river, I think they were kind of hanging down a little bit, but he was worried about it.
Nothing like skinny dipping in the river, or the creek, as they say in America. So that third story was really about the three boys, the two brothers and their friend messing around on the local creek. And of course, the first frost is your mother's story about her shoes, and Sadie is your aunt. So these short stories that you very cleverly put together are they're things from your past, aren't they?
Yes, they are. They're stories that are passed down. I don't think that we should forget our past. I don't think we should forget the people that were strong enough to go through it, the poverty, the doing without, and still have a good attitude, still come out of it as a decent person. And my mother, even after all the hard times that she went through, and her marriage to my father was difficult for her, she still was a great woman. She was a great mother. She loved her children. She might have loved us too much sometimes, but it wasn't, going out and buying us anything, because she didn't have any money. Even when I was a teenager, if she gave me $1 to go down and buy a hamburger, I felt like, hey, I got some money.
Mm.
I even looked up online how much was $100 in 1930 compared to now.
So how much?
$100 in 1930 would be like you had $1,600 in your pocket now.
There you go.
It was a lot back then.
It was a lot.
Yes.
I'm intrigued, Larry, to the dedication of the book. And I'm going to quote here. It says, "To all the people who struggle with few complaints, who work hard, hold on to their faith, and find contentment in the end." How poignant a statement is that to you?
How what?
How poignant is that statement to you?
Very much so. There's been times in my life, that I would complain about this or that, or, I didn't have this or enough of that. But it humbles me a little bit. It makes me look and think, I wish I were that strong. I wish I were that convicted to make something out of myself. You don't have to be rich. My mother was never rich, but as far as character,
she was rich in character.
She was very rich in character.
It's like my grandmother. She didn't have much money. Yes, she lived in Manhattan in New York for part of her life, but she didn't have much money. But she was a great character. She was very rich in character, and the stories that she used to tell us, especially about the shoes, and that's why the second story I've loved, because I could relate.
I appreciate that. I do. There was a lady who wrote a review on Country, and her review, and I really didn't write it for the young adult audience, but she said, young adults need to read this because maybe it would give them a dose of humble. And I think we all need to be humble at times,
Oh, absolutely. You also say in your dedication, you'd like to mention Pete Austen, who I assume you lent on for the historical knowledge that this guy had.
Yes, I did. His real name was Marvin, and everybody called him Pete. He was the superintendent at Langley Schools for years, and he knew all the backgrounds of people and families, and he could remember the what Langley looked like. Right now it's one rock store that has been closed for years. I never knew that Langley had 3 stores until I sat down and talked to him. We sat down one day after he'd retired. He and his wife were really sweet people, and he liked to drink Canadian Mist. So I bought a bottle of Canadian Mist and took it down to him, and we sat in his living room, and I had my little tape recorder, my Canadian Mist, and I listened to him talk. He gave me the description of what the town was like. He gave me people's names, and it's like Uncle Bud. He wasn't anybody's uncle, but everybody called him that. The Black Jim Jones and the Red Jim Jones and the Naughty Neck Jim Jones. He told me about those people. How you identify. There were probably 100 people in the whole community, and it was spread out over miles. But yet 3 men had the same name. And I was saying, if you're going to be sitting on the bench in front of the store listening to these stories, you got to know which Jim Jones they're talking about. So the young man had pimples or whatever on the back of his neck, and he was Naughty Neck Jim. And the other guy had a real red face, and he was Red Jim Jones. And the other guy they called Black Jim because he had moved into the area from Oklahoma. And it wasn't because of the color of his skin, it was because of his heart. He was a bad man. He was. I wrote a song about Black Jim Jones, and one of the lines in there was he was not called black from the color of his skin, but the low-down condition his condition was in, which was pretty summary. But Pete was a wealth of information. He was such a he married into close relation of family. His children are my 3rd or 4th cousins, I think. But he was a wonderful man.
Larry, where can people get your book?
They can. The ebook is available at Amazon.com. The paperback and the PDF version is available at my website. It's Larry K. Morphew, MORPHEW-author.com.
Do you have any more books in the pipeline?
Yes, I do. I have one with the working title of The Prophet of Willow Bend. And it is, it's fiction, but I've incorporated some stories that were passed down from my older brother. But this is, again, growing up in a poor part of Arkansas. The 3 brothers are all teenagers, very close in age, 13, 14 months between them. And they have some pretty wild adventures, similar to my brothers.
Well, Larry, it's been a wonderful experience. It's been an absolute honor talking to you about your book. His book is called Country Folk, everybody. It's for those who love, I think, bygone days, especially those who stem from rural backgrounds anywhere in the world, but possibly more so for folk whose heritage is deeply rooted in America's Deep South. This is a book I think you're all going to love. So, Larry Morphew, thank you for joining me today on Talking Books. It's been a great pleasure, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the book. I found it very engaging and at times very touching. Larry, thank you.
Thank you, John. My pleasure.
I'm JT Crowley. Thanks for listening, watching, wherever you are in the world. Everybody, stay safe.